populism is not, in fact, an ideology at all. It's the people are right, and this small group with a lot of power is wrong. And you can have populism of the far left, and you can have populism of the far right, and in a way, you can have populism of the center.
Well, hello out there in podcast land. Welcome to a new edition of the Liberal Patriot Podcast. I'm your host, Rui Teixeira, and every couple of weeks we bring you the very finest and heterodox conversation and analysis of the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today, I couldn't be more pleased to have Derek Thompson here to talk to us about various and sundry things, including his new book. Derek is a staff writer at the Atlantic. I'm sure many of you have read a lot of his work, which he is typically excellent and spots a lot of very interesting trends. He's author of the books Hitmakers and On Work, Money, Meaning, and Identity. Are you sure you covered enough stuff there? He's also host of the podcast Plain English. And of course, what we're going to be talking about today mostly is the book he just put out with Ezra Klein called Abundance. Now, I do love a book title without a subtitle. That's just awesome. That's what we did with the Emerging Democratic Majority. And generally, I highly recommend this book, so everybody should get out there right now. Well, maybe you want to listen to this podcast first to see if you like it. But it's on Amazon. You can buy the Kindle. You can buy many copies to send to your friends. Really get the abundance thing going. So I urge you to do that because it's really an excellent and stimulating read. It's very clear. It's got a lot of detail, but not too much detail. So if you want to do the abundance thing, this is a great place to start. So there has been, Derek, a marvelous amount of discussion about the book, even controlling for the big platforms you guys have. I do think it's gotten out there, maybe even more than I would have predicted to begin with. But it's at least within the realm of possibility that there are some people out there who have not heard much about the book and still don't quite know what it's about. So what is it about, and what would you want people to most know about the book if they knew very little at all about you or the book? What's your pitch?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Rui. And the truth is, we have defined the book now so many different times for so many different audiences.
Right,
I'm not trying to insult the question at all. I'm trying to praise it. It actually is a really interesting exercise to think, okay, what of the 17 different definitions of this book
I want 13. I want number 13.
Is most important for this conversation. Look, you're a political thinker. This is you have a wonderful political Substack, and so let me try to define the book very squarely in the realm of politics.
Okay.
I think that American politics is often oriented around specific binaries. There are binaries that last for decades, like are you a liberal or are you conservative? Are you socially liberal or are you socially conservative? There are binaries that last just a few years in 2 to 4 year election cycles. Are you pro or anti-Medicare for all? Are you pro an individual mandate and universal health insurance? This book is trying to ask people to evaluate the world and their politics along a new set of binaries. One binary is scarcity versus abundance. What is it that we need most that we don't have enough of? And how do we build more of that? Especially housing, clean energy, government capacity, which we sometimes call state capacity, transit, infrastructure, and even something like scientific breakthroughs and technologies that help people. Where do we not have enough of it? Well, I'm talking to you from San Francisco right now, so it's not very difficult to say where we don't have enough housing. I just look outside of the window that's just to my right, and I see one of the most famous examples of a housing scarcity in the entire United States. But there's also other scarcities. I think very strongly that the U.S., like the world, has an obligation to accelerate clean energy technology. I know this is a place where we have a little bit of a disagreement. We can talk about that. But I think especially blue states need to get out of their own way and match their priorities with their processes. If they say that climate change is so important, why the hell do they make it so difficult to build solar and wind energy technology? So that's one binary. What is scarce that needs to be abundant? Another binary that I think has been really juicy, clicky for a lot of people in the political space right now is the binary between government that sucks and government that accomplishes things, or government that is slow versus government that is fast. Government that is slow is the state of California authorizing $33 billion to build a high-speed rail system that doesn't exist. Right? Government is slow when it spends $1.7 million trying to build a toilet in the Noe Valley of California and failing to do so
excessive.
for years and years. Does seem excessive. Yeah, I mean, my toilet is $1.8 million at home, but I didn't realize other people were in that general vicinity.
Right.
And so that's another lens that we're asking people to evaluate the world through. Where is government broken, especially when it's broken in achieving progressive ends? And how can we help government work better? So we can talk about examples there. But one thing that I think has been really, really interesting, and I wonder how you'd evaluate this particular definition of abundance as it clicks into sort of modern democratic politics. Rui, as you know, we're in an age of profound institutional distrust and anti-establishment fervor. I mean, the Democratic Party itself is polling at 29% approval. That is the lowest overall approval rate in the history of the CNN poll. The left has always had an easy way to run against the party, right? Bernie Sanders in AOC right now, well, Bernie Sanders in particular, is going around the country and speaking to enormous crowds that number in the tens of thousands.
Oligarchy, man. Yeah.
Yelling about the oligarchy, which I do think is a problem in many ways, and blaming the Democratic Party for not caring about the working class. One thing that I think is difficult for the center left, for Democratic moderates, is we are so lawyerly, we are so institutional, that it can be difficult for the center left to come up with a compelling argument for why the Democratic Party itself has failed. Right? Many of the people on the center left and the Biden, Obama, Harris wing are often defending the Democratic Party, defending the Obama record or the Biden record or the way that Kamala Harris ran the campaign. And what a lot of people are interested in this center-left lane is what is a compelling anti-institutional narrative that still asks voters to vote for the Democratic Party. And one of them is, I think, this way that this narrow path that we've tried to carve between, on the one hand, criticizing Donald Trump vociferously, but also identifying the many ways that the places that liberals have the most power are also examples of governance failures. And so I think that a lot of folks interested in that double negative narrative, how do I criticize both the right and find an anti-institutional narrative for my own lane, are interested in a book that so clearly diagnoses the problems of the Democratic Party of the last few decades.
Yeah, no, I agree with most of that. I mean, you're singing a song that I've sung a variant of at various times. I mean, as I said in a piece I recently wrote, I was for the abundance agenda before it was cool. Not that I didn't pick up the term from you, but, I was like pushing it when most people were like, what? Abundance agenda? What's that? Now a lot more people know what it is, which I think is great. I think it is fantastic stuff to get out there into the so-called discourse. But I do have some questions about it. First question I'd have, since we're kind of in the, who is this appealing to? If you read the book, I mean, and think you say this fairly explicitly at some point, you basically kind of pitch it as, we're liberals, and we want liberals to wake up, which is fine. But liberals are like 25, a quarter of the population, right? Most people, overwhelming number of people are moderate to conservative. So why did you decide to pitch it so explicitly at liberals when they are, in fact, a distinct minority of the population? Why didn't you make it broader?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. This was a tactical decision that Ezra and I made that, if I recall the conversations around that paragraph you're referencing, which I believe is in the introduction, I believe we touched on a couple of things. First, a good book has to be focused. You cannot write a good book that's for everybody. Even books that can be read by everybody tend to have a specific audience in mind. And we didn't want to spend a lot of time persuading people that liberal goals were worthy. That's a different project. We wanted to spend a lot of time focusing on, with electric clarity, the irony that liberals and progressives in America have in many ways divorced their processes and their outcomes. They say they want housing abundance. They make it impossible to build housing in blue cities and blue states. Yeah. They say they want to protect climate change.
On fire. Yeah.
Well, and it really does piss me off. To see in Washington D.C. I wrote this essay last year called "The Problem of Front Lawn Liberalism," where I talked about how annoyed I was that in my own neighborhood in Northwest DC, you saw all of these signs in front lawns that said, kindness is everything. No human being
They're
is
all
illegal.
over my neighborhood too, man.
And these are places that in many ways, not only are some of them zoned in ways that are explicitly exclusionary, but often many of these neighbors will rise up and stop developments to make those parts of the city more affordable. And in fact, if I recall, there was an announcement by the State Department that said that one of the few cities that they had trouble relocating Iraqi refugees was Washington, D.C., because prices were so high. And so that just struck me as this insane hypocrisy that we have this front lawn language of kindness and this backyard policy of exclusionary zoning. I hated that. And I wanted to go hard at, we wanted to go hard at that in the book. So that's one thing that I would say about the benefits of focus for a project like a book. But I want to pair that observation with another observation, which is that one thing you can't control when you write a book is its reception in the marketplace. And it has been stunning to me how many folks on the center and center-right want to talk to us about this book and often say, wow, there's a lot in this book that I agree with even more than I agree with the ruling regime of the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. So there is an irony in that it's almost like, I don't know if this is a paradox that works for all book projects, but in a way, like to go big, aim small, right? There are benefits to having your work read if your work is narrowly focused. And it has been really interesting and heartening to me to see so many people read the project in the right light who wouldn't necessarily self-identify as liberals, but would rather self-identify as moderates, independents, folks in the center-right. Because ultimately, and I know that you're a partner in this particular sentiment, the goal of the Democratic Party is not to maintain a 48% coalition that goes into every quadrennial election, 48-48, and hopes to get lucky with the next 1.5%. Ultimately, it would be really fucking great if we had a coalition that went up into the 51, 52, 54 percentage points. And that requires bringing people on board who right now might self-identify as a former Romney Republican or as an independent. And I've been really grateful to see how many people are interested in this message who I don't think would identify as precisely the liberals that you correctly note we wrote this book for.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, maybe that's part of your fiendish plan to rope as many people as possible into this. It seems like it's for liberals, but it's really, from
well, it's not,
people. We're getting reactions.
I know you're being joking, but right. You could call it fiendish. But ultimately, democracy is just a very simple weighing machine. Right? Like the former Romney voters' vote is worth as much as the former Bernie voters' vote. So it doesn't matter to the ultimate outcome where the vote comes from. It matters how many votes you count. And so winning a popularity contest sometimes means bringing onto your boat, bringing into your tent folks who you don't necessarily agree with on most issues. But ultimately, it's important to win the popularity contest if what you want is power.
Yeah, no, I get that. Obviously, I agree with it 100%. But, it did strike me at times reading the book that, you generally tended to refer to conservatives as people who wanted to, immiserate poor people and, have all these terrible values. And, of course, the current administration is a combination of Snidely Whiplash and Adolf Hitler. So it didn't seem...
I don't think Hitler's name appears in the book, but I'm happy to have a page reference.
Right. No, I meant, but conservatives at some point basically are put in that bucket, not the Adolf Hitler bucket, but they don't give a shit about poor people bucket, which strikes me as a bit unfair in the sense that they have their own version of what would work for poor people, and their goal isn't just, Grover Norquist may want to strangle the government in a bathtub, but tons of conservatives actually have a much more moderate position. But let's leave that aside. We can argue about the good and the bad conservatives. But one thing that, you're appealing to liberals. That's great. And it's having these unintended effects of bringing in people from outside the liberal world. But what about the fact that so many of the things you're advocating are absolute anathema to a lot of liberals, particularly the most active liberals, the people in the NGOs, There's this whole NGO industrial complex, which is full of college-educated liberals. And for them, deregulation is a tool of Satan. And you've already gotten a fair amount of blowback on this. So in a sense, one wonders why is the Sierra Club going to give up on NEPA, right? I mean, this is not where their heads are at and not where their money's at, not where their institutional weight is at. So are you, in a sense, not, as the immortal Bill Clinton put it, hunting where the ducks are?
It's a good question. And maybe you're right. Maybe the groups just won't go along with this. I can't control their reaction. You write a book, you make an argument, you go on between 10,000 and 1.2 billion podcasts. You do your best.
Something like that, yeah.
And folks are under no obligation to agree with you. In fact, folks are under no obligation to even trust you. There's a lot of folks who think that Ezra and I are, funded by the Koch brothers or something, which we understand to be utterly ridiculous.
Right.
I can see the text thread between me and Ezra working out hey, should we write this book? I like your ideas. You like my ideas.
Right.
Maybe we should write this book. I try very hard to change people's minds, but I'm not responsible for their minds.
That's completely fair.
Let me. That's a broader comment. Let me go directly at this point, because this is a project of persuasion, and we're trying to persuade people of many different things in the book. But let me zero in on one particular thing I want to persuade people of. Right now, I think the word deregulation codes as conservative. It codes as Reaganite. It codes as neoliberal. It codes as being obsessed with allowing markets to run rampant and corporate profits to go to the moon. But there's no question to me that allowing markets to work better in some allowing housing markets to work better in many cities would help progressives achieve the progressive outcome of making housing more affordable and allowing people to live where they want to live. I furthermore think that deregulation doesn't just mean removing rules that allow markets to work. It also sometimes means removing rules that keep government from achieving its own ends. Right? Ezra has this lovely line that he's used a lot on this book tour where he says, I want to deregulate the government. And some people understand electrically what that means immediately, and some people don't. But let me explain it. He means getting government rules out of the way to allow government to achieve its outcomes. Right? A great example is the long story that we tell about California high-speed rail. A classic liberal outcome to reduce pollution, to reduce commutes, to increase transit equity. And California has, for an infinitude of reasons, found it impossible to achieve an outcome that it understands to be progressive. One of my favorite new examples that we talked about a lot on the tour is Biden's rural broadband policy.
A classic.
Right? I mean, it is just unbelievable, right? You have in 2021 Biden announcing the bipartisan infrastructure law, and he and Pete Buttigieg say it is the most important infrastructure bill in modern American history. It includes $42 billion to build out rural broadband to help connect marginalized Americans to the internet economy and telehealth, right? An absolute liberal mitzvah in every single way. The yada, yada, yada here is that there is a 14-step process that the states have to go through in order to get access to this $42 billion of authorized spending. Right? The FCC has to draw a map of the places in the U.S. that are underserved by internet, and then there's a challenge period, and then the states draw their own maps, and there's a challenge period, and then the states send in their 5-year plan and their letter of intent, and then their final plan, and there are challenges from the Commerce Department, and it takes years and years and years to go through this process. And now 4 calendar years after that bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed, Donald Trump is about to tear up the entire system and essentially replace it with Starlink to award Elon Musk with tens of billions of dollars in government contracts. Is that a liberal success? Is it a liberal success
no.
to authorize $42 billion and then lard up the process with so many specific progressive instincts and progressive interests that it makes it impossible to actually build the thing that you authorized? I would say clearly fucking not. So when we're asking for and calling for government to become obsessed with its own efficiency, government to deregulate itself. Yes, I understand how the use of that word in some quarters codes as conservative. But I'm sorry, you are out of your mind if you think it is conservative or Republican to think that when Biden says, I want to build rural broadband, we should actually build rural broadband. And so much of this book is about orienting liberals and progressives around seeing the world through these kind of government failures, these kind of incredible, painful, and reputationally disastrous disconnections between our stated goals and our actual outcomes. In a way, Rui, and I'll get off my soapbox right after this, in a way, it's not so different from the front lawn liberalism that I talked about, right? Putting the sign in your front lawn saying, I believe in helping immigrants, and then having backyard policies that make it impossible for Iraqi refugees to resettle in the area is the exact same as Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg. I'm not criticizing them directly necessarily, but I'm criticizing the system that they represent, getting on television and bragging about $42 billion to hook up Americans to rural broadband, and then behind the scenes creating a process that makes it impossible to actually do that thing. It's the same disconnect. It's the same virtue signaling of language that is fundamentally disconnected from any actual effort to prioritize speed and outcomes. Americans are not stupid. They recognize this. They see this. They feel when the Democratic Party has become the party of obsessing over words and language, and is not the party that obsesses over what we actually build in the world, what we actually deliver to them with the $1.2 trillion of infrastructure spending that we authorize. And fixing the Democratic Party's reputation, which right now is in the gutter of all gutters, I think requires us reorienting our priorities around not just associating success with how much money we can authorize, but associating success with what we can build.
Noah Smith memorably called that a checkism at one point in one of his analyses. The Democrats think once the check is written, hey, we did our duty. Not as simple as that. In a way, I suppose you could say an abundance liberal is a Democrat who got mugged by Democratic governance, you know? I mean, it's kind of like, whoa, this isn't what I had in mind. You know, we need something completely different.
I am, of course, loath to over-associate our cause with the with the definitional template of neoconservatism. But I agree. There is a sense, I will grant you, that we are trying to show liberals in particular the receipts of progressive proceduralism. This is what the system has wrought. And if you're okay with it, if you're okay with the 5 states with the highest rates of homelessness all being governed by Democrats, and you're okay with hundreds of thousands of people leaving the places governed by Democrats, and you're okay with us losing so much ground in the 2030 census that Kamala Harris could have won all of the blue wall states and still lost the election if the election happened in 2032, if you're okay with all of that, then fine. But just understand that you are signing yourself up for permanent minority status.
Fair enough. And you, in your book at various points, you point out we say we have these goals, and some of these goals are being done in, or at least they're much better at it in red states like Texas. I mean, clean energy, housing, and so on. Again, that's not really your audience, but you do kind of work that in there. I mean, you're not conservatives or neoconservatives, but you do see that there's some things that are being done by people on that side of the aisle, so to speak, that actually do make sense, even if they do it in a kind of screwed up way. You can even say that about some of the things that Trump is doing, but I'll leave that aside. Well, here's another problem, or it's an associated problem, which is that, I'm for, generally speaking, your agenda, I think. I know a lot of people who would sign up for it, check that box. But I'm me, you're you, and we're not the median liberal Democrat. And it seems to me that the kind of thing that really excites people at this point is what we were alluding to a little earlier. It's like fight, fight the oligarchy. They're out there with AOC and Bernie Sanders. They're the Warrenites still doing their thing. I mean, there's a lot of energy in terms of the grassroots, so-called, of the Democratic Party that is all behind we must smash the Trumpist fascist, train. And I think I was just talking to someone on a plane the other day, actually, who had attended your thing at the Sixth and I Synagogue, and she was saying, yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting. I bought the book. I'm going to read it, but it was like, she was really a big AOC fan, right? I mean, and I think that's really what excites a lot of people out there is that sort of robust, tear it all down, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. And that does not really lend itself to the kind of rational thinking that you guys are, I think, rightly trying to promote. Let's look at costs and benefits. Let's look at what we actually get for our money. Let's get regulations out of the way that don't work. Let's actually deliver for people. I think it's much more, in a sense, emotionally satisfying for a lot of people out there to just say, especially liberals, to just say, my God, this is like hell on earth. We have to stop this.
So I think I know where this question is going, but I want to make sure that I answer it to your satisfaction. We've gotten version of the questions. I'll speak personally. I've gotten a version of this question that says, is this agenda too technocratic to win over tens of millions of people in a Senate or presidential election?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's actually two questions embedded in that question that are important to distinguish. It's not difficult for any Democrat to juxtapose their policies with Donald Trump. I mean, running against Trump and Vance and Musk is incredibly simple, right? And the way in which Abundance, the book, and the ideas that we're discussing right now push back against Trump are not subtle at all. It's very clear to draw this line, that Trump right now is scrambling the economy in a way that is incredibly scarcity-minded. He's identifying the fact that we don't have enough houses, and his solution is to reduce immigration, right? Identifying the fact that we don't have enough manufacturing, according to him, and so we're going to have less trade. Identifying the fact that the economy isn't working to the way that he wants it to, and so we're going to have less economic growth. He's essentially saying, I'm not even going to rule out a recession. Right? This is an incredibly scarcity-minded approach to politics that pairs, I think, beautifully with the message for abundance. You want more housing? Let's make it easy to build housing. You want more manufacturing? Let's keep the Chips and Science Act, because high-tech, high-tech, national security-based manufacturing is absolutely an American mitzvah. You want more economic growth? Let's actually have more economic growth and not seek a recession. These are very, very easy arguments to make. I think the harder question that you're alluding to is, how does abundance play coalitionally in, say, a Democratic primary, right? Yeah. If you, whether it's a Senate primary, or maybe it's just easier for me to think for the purposes of simplification, the 2027 debates. How would an abundance liberal hold up against a Bernie progressive like AOC? So, someone asked me last night at our first event in San Francisco how I would sell abundance to someone at a dive bar in San Francisco. And I told them I thought that was a really fun question, because I love this idea of, I love going on these shows that are like, wonky policy shows, and then also having the question, like, if you have 10 seconds with a dude, drinking a Budweiser at a dive bar, and he's like, oh, you wrote a book, what's it about? Like, what do you say? Right. I haven't perfected this, but we can workshop it right now. I think what you say is, hey, this person lives in San Francisco. Hey, you know how shit seems to be broken everywhere you look? You don't deserve that. You deserve a government that solves shit and doesn't break shit. And right now, in California, you have a government that has historically broken a lot of shit. And in Washington, you have a government that is breaking a lot of shit. And you need a government that can do shit. And what we are is a coalition of people who try to get shit done. Right? That is the dive bar message. And the way that could work, I have no idea what the world's going to look like in 2027. So it would be ridiculous for me to say, and that's of course going to be a more popular message than down with the oligarchy, every billionaire is a policy mistake. I have no idea. But ultimately, look, it's not that hard. It's not that hard to turn any ideology into a populist ideology. populism is not, in fact, an ideology at all. It's a costume you can put on anything. It's
fundamentally about the
right,
people versus the elites. So
the people are right.
It's a lot of things.
And this small group with a lot of power is wrong. Right? That's populism. And you can have populism of the far left, and you can have populism of the far right. And in a way, and I'm still thinking about the best way to message this, you can have populism of the center. Right?
Well, let's call it abundance populism. We've hit on it.
What is
magic
YIMBYism?
formula?
What is YIMBYism? YIMBYism is the argument that there is a minoritarian coalition that is keeping our city from the housing abundance it deserves and driving up the cost of the most important thing in the world, which is the place that you live. That's populism.
Right.
The people are good.
Right.
The dark special interests that try to wrest private power away from public gain, they're bad. YIMBYism is populism. It just doesn't necessarily speak with the language of populism. But I think, again, that populism is not an ideology. It is a costume. It's a shirt. Anybody can wear it. And the center can wear it too. And I think that maybe one reason this book has struck a chord with some folks that consider themselves, left of center, is that we have, in a way, without necessarily explicitly trying, given them a kind of populist language for an ideology that never quite struck them as populist. We gave them a way to run against the system by pointing out the myriad ways that the system fails itself by becoming so obsessed with procedure and process that we make it impossible to achieve outcomes. And yes, that part of the definition is technocratic, and I would never necessarily use that language of trying to make an appeal on a stump or just talking to my friend at the local dive bar. But this is an argument that lends itself to populism too, and I'm not embarrassed of that at all.
Right, yeah. Well, who cares if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice, as the great Deng Xiaoping put it. I mean, you could even make the argument that if people come back at you and say, well, that sounds like something a Republican would say, or a conservative, you can also say, who cares if a cat is red or blue so long as it catches mice, right? I mean, you're trying to get done what needs to get done. And if people want to look at it that way, that's their God-given right as Americans.
I'd say we get this question at every single event. Utah's building houses, Texas is building houses, why aren't you guys just Republicans? I have two answers to that. One is that, Donald Trump won an affordability election. And he could have entered office and given a speech saying, I'm going to govern like a Texas Republican and make it as easy as possible to build houses in the states and cities that have the most housing demand. I don't think he would use that exact language, but he could have used that vibe. He didn't. Well, the first thing that he did is increase tariffs by 25% on two of the most important items, two of the most important material inputs for housing, lumber from Canada and drywall gypsum from Mexico.
This is
not someone who wakes up in the morning thinking, how do I make housing more affordable? I'm obsessed with this. No, this is a man who's obsessed with, getting world leaders on the phone to bend the knee and getting, the presidents of Columbia and Yale University to call and beg for forgiveness. He's motivated by, a set of personality quirks that is entirely orthogonal to the issue of housing. So that's one. I'm not a Republican because because Donald Trump has nothing to do with the policies I'm interested in. But the second thing is, look, if Texas or Utah or Georgia or North Carolina have a better set of housing policies than California or New York or Oregon,
you'd say great.
Then fuck yeah. Let's do that, right?
For sure.
I mean, to observe, for example, that Texas has a better default for constructing in the physical world does not make me a Texas Republican. Any more than observing that Japan has a fantastic default for building high-speed rail doesn't make me Japanese. Or observing that Madrid and Lisbon do a wonderful job building transit.
Certainly that the Chinese get her done. It doesn't make you a Chinese communist regime backer, for sure.
No, I mean, there's a certain way in which being clear about your outcomes and defining your outcomes as progressive, that's what makes me a progressive. The way we get there, the way we achieve those outcomes within the boundary of the law, I'm less concerned about borrowing good ideas and being accused of representing or holding all of the ideological conclusions of the places from which I'm borrowing those ideas. That's just not how I think about good governance or policy.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Well, let's, we're kind of running out of time here, but I did want to touch on the issue of climate, which is something we've talked about before, and I think we have some disagreements. But I think it's fair to say that when you read the book and listen to you guys on podcasts, whatever, I think it's pretty central to your argument. I mean, that housing is big in your sort of motivational foundation for the book. But another big motivation is essentially we must have a rapid clean energy transition because otherwise catastrophic climate change cannot be stopped. And that's mentioned a number of times in your book. It's not just an aside. It's pretty central. And I even heard Ezra interviewed by Oren Cass of the American Compass. And Oren was kind of like pushing him about, well, what do you mean by abundance? What is the fundamental thing here? You talk a lot about climate and clean energy. I mean, basically, Ezra wound up saying, well, that's my version of abundance, right? I mean, I'm not talking about more stuff or even necessarily cheap energy. I'm talking about clean energy. I want an abundance of clean energy, not just an abundance of energy, which then raises all kinds of questions about what's going to be the effect of that on the price of energy, on the suburban aspirational lifestyle most people have. Josh Barrow made this point, I think, in an excellent column on your book. All Latino guys want a big-ass truck, right? So clean energy may be your version of abundance, but it's not really the working class's version of abundance, which is less complicated. They just want like cheap stuff, and they want to benefit from high productivity growth because they'll have better jobs and they'll be richer and they can get a big house in the suburbs. That's what people want. But do you worry that too much? You're sort of like consciously or unconsciously, you want people to want the stuff you have as opposed to wanting the stuff they actually want. Because the former fits better into your version of abundance than does the latter, which is like what people, I think, more intuitionally think of as abundance.
Yeah. Let me pick some pieces of that out. My values are my values. It doesn't make any sense for me to outsource my values to a public survey. In that case, they're not my values. Mm-hmm. I care about climate change. I do think climate change is an enormous problem. I think that the way in which it will present as a problem is fundamentally somewhat mysterious. That in many ways, it's the second and third order effects that we should be more afraid of than the first order effects. It's not just the increasing chaos of the climate. It's the way that increasing chaos of the climate affects politics, affects migration, affects insurance rates, affects housing markets. I absolutely think this is, right along with artificial intelligence and maybe along a longer time horizon, declining fertility, just one of the major meta trends that will define the next 50 years of 50 to 150, 100,000 years of human life. I care very much about it. I'm also a realist, and I understand that a lot of people don't give a shit. And
right. Mm-hmm.
I understand that fundamentally democracy, like I said at the beginning, democracy is not an arbitration. It's not two groups delivering their best ideas to a judge who awards the most moral argument the victory, right? Democracy is not arbitration. It's just a weighing machine. And so you have to fundamentally be interested in getting votes. And that's why where I've come down on this issue is that the energy transition that I want is clean and electric and cheap. I think it's really, really important for clean energy transition folks to be obsessed with price. Absolutely obsessed with price.
I'd agree with that.
Because nothing will doom this movement faster. As we've just seen in Germany and the UK, nothing will doom this movement faster than a clean energy transition being poisoned by a rapid increase in energy prices, which is blamed on green progressives and hurts the case for decarbonization for a generation. And for that reason, what I want is, one, for the US to have an incredibly muscular industrial policy for accelerating the build-out of clean energy technology, including solar and wind, but not just that, enhanced geothermal, modular nuclear, investments in fusion, whatever else I can't even think of. The Chinese are trying to find some way to use lasers to focus solar rays and create super solar energy technology. Do it all. Technology is so important here. I mean, technology got us here in the first place. If wind energy weren't invented in the 1800s and the solar cell hadn't been invented by Bell Labs in the 1940s, 1950s, we wouldn't even have the opportunity to decarbonize. We would just have to accept either catastrophic climate change or degrowth. I should throw nuclear in there as well, which was also essentially invented in the late 40s, 1950s. But I'm a realist. I understand the prices are fundamental. And as a result, I do think that a certain amount of natural gas exploration production is going to be essential to allowing the US to continue to produce more joules of energy with less carbon intensivity before we build out a more purely renewable plus low carbon energy economy. I don't.
Shockingly, I agree with you.
I don't see another way of getting everything that we need. Right. I wish there were a magic persuasion wand that would allow me to both pass an enormous, even in this interest rate environment, an enormous IRA times 2, an IRA 2.0, and also waved a magic wand over people's brains and got them to accept a period of slightly higher energy prices in exchange for that clean energy build-out. I don't trust it's going to work that way. I am concerned about the political implications of decarbonizing in an era of rising energy prices. And so for that reason, I do think that there's going to be the word transition is always there, energy transition. There's going to be a transition. And I want to move away from coal and oil as fast as possible because natural gas is significantly less carbon intensive. But, my optimism and my realism are a little bit in tension here. It's unfortunate that prices is so central, but I acknowledge that it is.
Yeah, I mean that is an unavoidable tension between energy policy and prices that I think you correctly realize, and I'm glad you do. I mean, I think that's very honest of you to grapple with that. But I would wonder, given that the difficulties this potentially creates between the cost of energy and living standards and the transition and all that jazz, did you consider putting more emphasis on the competition with China angle, which you guys do talk about, but much less? Because that's something, if we're worried about working class people supporting, this abundance agenda, wouldn't it have been better to talk more about how it's really all about, basically making sure the Chi-Coms don't eat our lunch than it is about, the clean energy transition and climate change? Did you guys consider that?
Maybe rephrase the question. I'm not entirely clear on what
Well, in other words, if you're gonna hang your abundance agenda on achieving a goal, the goal of climate change and the clean energy transition is vexed in terms of its relationship to prices and its relationship to the coalitional difficulties of bringing more working class people into your coalition. So why not basically build it more around competition with China and the threat from China, which is something working class people actually believe in and are worried about? Whereas climate change is like a 16th level consideration for a lot of them. So that's my question. I mean, did you think about that, or do you think that's actually the wrong way to think about it?
I think there's absolutely political value. Well, we've seen that there's enormous political value in the threat of an external hegemon. I mean, we've seen this actually in two very different ways in the last 70 years. In the 1940s, 1950s, the rise of the Soviet Union absolutely accelerated America's technological policy. I mean, it was Sputnik in 1957 that not only birthed ARPA, which became DARPA, but also the space race. And the space race essentially launched the software revolution, or accelerated the software revolution. But also, just in the last few years, David Leonhardt's written a lot about the sort of emerging populism, the sort of centrist populism of folks on the left and right, Democrats and Republicans, coming together to pass the CHIPS and Science Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, in part because of their fear that it is China that now leads the world in its capacity to build, and the U.S. is falling behind, especially on the most important small technology in the world, which is advanced semiconductors. So I do think that trying to take reality clearly, we see that the external threat of China produces a kind of focusing mechanism. But on the issue of climate change itself, I think it's the chapter on energy. The chapter on energy is not as focused on China, because what we're interested in is the question of why does a country, and in particular, why do states and cities run by Democrats, who value climate change in their spoken priorities, not demonstrate that value in their agenda and policies and rulemaking? Why, for example, do we make it so difficult, or I should turn that around, why has it become so easy to use the tools of the 1960s, 1970s environmental revolution, like NEPA, to block projects that we fundamentally understand to be pro-climate, whether it's building dense housing or building wind and solar? And so that chapter is very focused on, again, going back to the first message or the first theme of the book that I talked about, getting out of our own way to make it easier to build that which we agree to be a national priority. Right? My point about the energy transition is that it can simultaneously be an urgent national priority to accelerate the clean energy revolution, while also a political necessity to keep energy costs from doing here what they did in Germany, which wiped out the centrist party more than any election, I believe, in 200 years. Right? That cannot be the electoral outcome that clean energy advocates hope for. We have to hope for two things: both restrained energy prices and a massive clean energy build-out. And so having both is difficult, but I'm not sure politically how you get one without the other.
Yeah, no, that's well said. Well said. I think you posed the problem very well. And Derek, I think we've run out of time here. I know you're probably talked out from all the gazillion podcasts and book talks you've done. I appreciate you making the time to be on the Liberal Patriot podcast. And I urge people to go out there and buy the book in whatever form you choose to consume your books. I mean, it could be electronic, could be paper, it could be reading over someone's shoulder, but just read it. So I can't be any more assertive than that about plugging it. I do think that everyone will benefit from reading it. And, hats off to you for starting a discussion, really. I mean, obviously I have my disagreements with you or things I think are problems, but I just think it's terrific that you've really started this discussion, because it's exactly what we need to have. So again, thanks for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. And do you live in D.C.? Don't you? Or do you?
I will be moving back to D.C. this summer. I currently live in North Carolina.
Okay, well, when you're back, when you're in the big town, I'll buy you lunch at AEI, my typical offer to everyone on this podcast. And you too can benefit from that. So thanks again.
Thank you, Ray.